Um, Welcome everybody and good evening, and thank you for joining us in this ISCO UK meetup. I just need to read a few things as a house rule. These sessions are brought to you by the ISCO UK Meetup Committee. ISCO UK is a membership organisation. Our website www.iscouk.org holds the repository for all previous ISCO events, along with details on membership benefits and how to join. The ISCO site also has upcoming events and other relevant seminars and conferences. During the presentation, your mics will be muted. Please add your question at the end of the presentation in the chat box, and they will be answered by the speaker. The entire session will be recorded and available to listen via the ISCO website later. Please leave your feedback in the ISCO meetup comments if you have any, and let us know if you would like to present a talk in the ISCO UK meetup. This is for anyone, students, researchers, experts, and anyone in the KO area. On behalf of the ISCO UK meetup team, I have the pleasure to introduce to you Alexander Church from Metataxis, the consultancy experts in information management and information architecture. To you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Eric. Good evening, everyone. So I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully this will appear. So hopefully you're all seeing that. So, so tonight, just going to have a short session with about Microsoft Teams and how it touches on information architecture and governance. So what we'll do is to just explore some of those issues. We're not going to be able to go into huge amounts of detail given the time, but it just gives you hopefully a flavour for some of the issues and some of the things that you should be thinking about if you are implementing Microsoft Teams. So we'll talk a little bit about what Teams is, and then go into details about some of those information architecture and governance issues. So before I do, just a little bit of, no, why is that? No, okay, hang on. I've just got to swap that over, I think. Excuse me 1 second. That's wrong. That will work. Yeah. So a little bit about Metataxis. As Eric said, we're an information architecture and information management consultancy. We've been around for quite a long time now, nearly 20 years. We've all experts in information management or information architecture. Lots of skills and practical knowledge. All have been practitioners on the other side of the fence. They're not just consultants, but we previous lives worked in organizations. And as you can see, we've got experience in lots of different areas. And although we're technology agnostic, we do a lot with Microsoft 365, SharePoint, Teams, because that's where the market is, I suppose. Lots of organizations are using it, and it presents lots of challenges in this space. And as clients, it's just these usual slides, so I'll move on to that. So, what is Teams? So Teams is a Microsoft product. It's two main functions really, communication and collaboration. So on the communication side, there's lots of chat facilities, there's video conferencing and audio conferencing, telephony. It's kind of the replacement for Skype for business, which is gone now or going. And on the collaboration side, it's a platform that kind of allows you to work in context, really. So you have you can share files, you can have chat, you can manage tasks, you can add apps, and that's all within this the boundaries of a team. I mean, it's widely used, so I'm not going to go too much into that, but that's just as a headline. And it's just one part of Office 365. It's a whole set of cloud business applications, really, from Microsoft, covering Office 365, the Office suite of Word, Excel, etc., like that, etc., SharePoint, and lots of other applications. And Teams is just one part of that, but it integrates across various parts, as we shall see. Okay, so Teams. So Teams has really taken off over the last year. I mean, it's been around for some time now, but over the last year with lockdown and the move to remote working, it's really really exploded in terms of use. And one of the great things about it is, I think that IT departments have found that they can roll this out pretty quickly, and there's a need to roll it out. There was a demand and a need from people within the organizations to work virtually together, to collaborate, to have meetings, to video conferencing, to chat, and so on. And they could roll this out quickly and get everyone on board, and people were quickly using it, and they were collaborating, chatting, and everything. So that was all good. So it's really good in that sense. On the other hand, that ability to roll it out quickly and to give it to people very, very swiftly, and for IT just to be able to set it up and roll it out and get everyone on it and working, was also one of the worst things about it, and which is kind of where we're coming from with this presentation, this chat today. So it comes, I suppose, this comes with a health warning of turning it on, and that just if you turn Teams on and just give everyone the application and let them get on with it, then chaos will ensue, or at least it will get messy. Especially in large organizations with thousands of people creating teams here, there, and everywhere, it's just going to get chaotic. And with no governance in place, you're opening yourself up to information risk. And without thinking about information architecture, you're going to get that mess. You're going to have the structure, the organization that you perhaps want and need in order for people to be able to work efficiently, find the information they're looking for, and so on. So definitely there is a health warning around Teams. So it's creating a team. So when it's set up, IT in setting up teams can do one of two things. They can control who can set up a team, or they can just give everyone access to be able to create their own teams. Now, it is tempting to turn that ability for anyone to create a team on. To take away that restriction and to get people working, it's just think, well, yeah, I need to create a team, therefore you should be able to do it. IT might think, okay, we don't want to restrict or slow down collaboration or people working together. Please don't do this, IT. Microsoft may say that, yeah, it's a good thing to do to allow people to create a team and to work seamlessly and work quickly, but it does cause problems. So a piece of advice would be strongly to turn off that self-creation ability and put in place some sort of approval and provisioning process. There's different ways of doing this. I mean, it could just be a manual, so you turn off the ability to anyone to create a team, and it can be a request to IT, and that could just be an email going to IT to say, please can I have a team, and I need it for this purpose and can call it this, and so on. Or you can get a bit more sophisticated, and you could build your own provisioning process. So you can do that easily with Microsoft tools using sort of workflow, or Power Automate, as it's called, and Power Apps can supplement that within Microsoft 365. So you can create a nice workflow, and that can be driven off a request form. So you can capture the information that you need and want when you're creating that team. Alternatively, there's plenty of third-party apps on the market for to bolt onto teams as a provisioning process. So there's ways of doing this, but I suppose the headline is have a provisioning process. Don't just open it up to let anyone create a team. Okay. Now, it's worth us, I think, just having a look at the architecture of teams in terms of how it's all put together. This is quite, it's just a simplified version of that. But basically, when a team is created, it creates a Microsoft 365 group. And that Microsoft 365 group gets a SharePoint site, and it also gets a group mailbox. And this is important because this is where content is stored for a team. If you store files, they're stored in SharePoint, and if you create messages, they're stored in that group mailbox. Now, files, teams also, you can have one-to-one chats and also one-to-many, chats, just that chat functionality, and those chats are stored in other places. So those are stored in your own personal mailbox, the chats, and also any files that you share through that are stored in OneDrive. So you've got, when thinking about this and thinking about teams, and you think, well, I'm saying these things are stored in teams, and they're actually stored in teams, they're stored elsewhere. So it's kind of important to remember in terms of how to manage and govern that information, that this information is stored in these different repositories. Now, as I said, when you're storing files in Teams, they're actually stored in SharePoint. So every team has a SharePoint site behind it. Now, it does certain things when you create that. By default, it creates you a document library. And also you get within Teams, there's this concept of channels. So you have your team, then you have various channels, which allow you to subdivide your team into topics or whatever. And each of those channels has a folder within that document library within SharePoint. You get out of the box, default, you get something called a general channel. So there is a general folder within SharePoint. You can't not have that. That is just comes out and you get that. And so for every other channel that you create, you get a folder. So you quickly see this, behind the scenes, there's this architecture being built within SharePoint of a document library and folders. Okay. Now there's also this concept of private channels. So this is where a restricted access channel just to a subset of the team members. But in doing so, it does something quite odd. So actually, when you create a private channel, you're actually getting another SharePoint site behind the scenes. So it creates a separate SharePoint site, and that is where those files are shared. Basically, it's all to do with permissions and how SharePoint and Teams manages those permissions. So in order to keep that private channel secure, it creates a separate SharePoint site. And chat is not stored in the group mailbox, but it's stored in your personal mailbox, like those one-to-one chats. So you've got this using private channels, you've therefore, extended out those repositories where information is being stored, and that has some repercussions, but also just something to bear in mind of what's going on and how you might want to sort of govern and manage your environment. So we see that Teams is imposing an information architecture on us. So lots of people within, within SharePoint, when we've pre-Teams and even with Teams, when we look at SharePoint on its own, we construct this information architecture, and we think about how we use the elements of information architecture within SharePoint. How do we use libraries? What does a library represent? Are we going to use folders? And what is the nature of a folder? And it's all, for the last 5 years, 10 years, there's been a movement to get rid of folders. Folders were seen as old technology. It was all the shared drives, and we don't need folders anymore. Everything's in SharePoint is about metadata. And the folder is dead, long live metadata. Well, suddenly that's changed, because Teams is actually saying, well, no, we're going to make you use folders within SharePoint. So that gives us pause to think about how we might use information architecture. So we're getting folders, we have no choice. But we can still think about SharePoint and the information architecture, because that is living behind Teams, and we can expose that information architecture within Teams. So we have the SharePoint information architecture elements of sort of content types. We have metadata columns. We have the taxonomies, the term sets that sit behind them, and we can still use those within Teams. They're not as immediately obvious as they may be within SharePoint, but they're still there. And Teams is making that easier. So you used not to be able to expose custom columns or custom content types through Teams, but you can now. So it's something called the enhanced file view. So that has come along now. So you're seeing more elements of SharePoint being able to be exposed within Teams. So therefore, we can start to think about how we will use information architecture that we've always done within SharePoint and bring that into Teams, but have to work with that, what Teams is giving us in terms of folders. So we can, I think, consider doing this as part of the provisioning process. So we talked about the provisioning process earlier in terms of creating Teams, and part of what you might want to consider when doing that is, do we need to integrate some of these information architecture elements into this? So we can start having templates for creating a team. So we might have a project team template, and that might have certain content types within it. It might have certain columns. For example, it might have a column for the project status or project stage. So we can start bringing these elements in. So we're getting this combination of the Teams architecture that imposes upon you in terms of folders, and also the SharePoint architecture that we can bring in. Now, I just wanted to touch on team names. This is also why provisioning process is advisable. Within Teams, there's actually nothing to stop you creating a team with the same name as another team. It won't prevent you doing that, and this can obviously lead to lots of confusion and impact findability. So, especially in large organizations, you might have a central finance team, but you also might have finance teams in offices or for departments, large departments. So you might end up with 5, 6, 7, 8 teams, all with the same name, and there's nothing to distinguish them. They will just go, if you were a member of them all, we could see them all, it should be finance, 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 finance. So that's a problem. And although it allows you to create them, all it does is when it creates, for example, SharePoint will have a URL and they'll just have the team name as part of that URL and with just a number put on. So it doesn't help you in any way. So having some sort of naming convention, I think, is important as part of that provisioning process. Which might have distinguish if it's a, what department it is, if it's a project, if it has, and so on. So it's just having that is important. You can enforce that as part of a group naming policy within Azure AD, within Active Directory. So that sets, you can exclude, make people to have exclusions in words and team names. So you might exclude, team or department, and you can also impose certain prefixes. Now the problem with that is because it runs off AD, it's linked to whoever is creating the team. So if you put department name, if you choose the value of department name, it will choose your department name, and that might not necessarily be appropriate. So that's something just to consider. But I highly recommend having some sort of naming convention for teams. It will save a lot of bother in the long run, especially as your team's environment grows. Okay. Now, something I want to touch on with governance is around public or private teams. So we have this two different ways of setting up a team. It can be public, which basically means anyone can find that team. They can search for it and think, oh, here's this team, and anyone can join it. So you don't have to be invited. You don't have to have any special code to join. You can just find the team and make yourself a member. And then you can, once you're a member, you're in that team and you can post comments, you can read everything, you can access the files. Private teams are, as the name suggests, they are private, they're locked down, and you can only join if you're invited to join, or you might be sent a code to join. And you can further lock it down that private teams can be discoverable, as in I can find out that there's a team called XYZ and I can ask to join it, or you can make them completely invisible, so they're not even discoverable. So you have that further limit on what people can do. So you might say, well, if it's a public team, anyone can find it, anyone can join it, and anyone can search content. And you might say, well, that's good. That's a good thing. That's good for transparency, for being an open organization, that everyone can see that there's this team and everyone can see the content and search the content. But there's one thing to be aware of. So when they have a public team, everyone on the tenant actually becomes a site member of the SharePoint site. And that really means that within everyone has read, write, edit rights to the content that is stored in SharePoint. So we have these three levels in SharePoint. You've got site owners, site members, and site visitors. Site owners have all control, site members read write, and site visitors just read writes. So if you have a public team, what it actually means is anyone in the organization can edit or delete files in SharePoint, and they don't actually have to be a member of that team. So they can do everything within SharePoint because that sits behind, and if they've got access to SharePoint, and then they can go and find that content. So that's just something that we really need to be aware of. So here it is, just in there, just another way of looking at it. So we have these in the public team as site members. There's two groups who are site members: the team members and all staff. So everyone in the organisation. Whereas in the private team, the site members are just the team members. So again, this comes back to that provisioning process that we were talking about. So it's probably wise to consider changing that. So it's in SharePoint, so we can change permissions in SharePoint. So it'd probably be worth considering changing the permissions of all staff, even if you want to continue being open, but you might think, well, actually, we don't want them to have, we don't want everyone to have edit rights. So we change them to that group to become site visitors. So they can still see the content, they can still read the content, but they can't change it, they can't delete it. Okay, so I think that's something worth considering. Behind the scenes in SharePoint, you've got all these permissions. So just think about how those permissions are applied. Another part of the governance I think we need to consider is the life cycle of teams. So teams, some teams are probably going to be long-lived, and for example, ones that are departmental teams. Other ones probably have a limited lifespan. Projects only go on for a certain amount of time. So you're probably going to want to have some sort of life cycle management of this. And there's a number of different tools that can do this. Here we've got expiration policies, retention policies, something called retention label policies, something slightly different, and just something called archiving. So we're going to look at these briefly now and just give you some thought about how and what they can do and how you might want to use them. So it's just simplified again how these things apply. So we have expiration policies, which are actually applied to the 365 group, the Microsoft group, and that will then, you can set that, and that will then delete the team. And along with it, it will delete the SharePoint site, it will delete the group mailbox, and therefore all the files and messages. Within Microsoft 365, there's something called the Compliance Center. And within the Compliance Center, you have a range of tools, one of which allows you to manage retention. And there's a couple of ways of doing this. There's retention policies, which are sort of a broad brush approach to applying retention, and retention labels, which are a bit more refined, which I'll talk about in a second. Now, retention policies, you can apply those to the team to manage the retention or deletion of messages. So you might say, actually, we want to delete all messages after 2 years, or after, sometimes it's for chats, you might, the one-to-one chats, you might have a very short retention on them. So we can use retention policies to do that. One thing to bear in mind is, talked about private channels earlier, so managing the retention policies that you apply to a team will manage the retention and deletion of the messages, the chat within those teams, but it won't do it if there's a private channel at the moment anyway. I think it is in development or private preview. I think it is in private preview at the moment to extend that to messages in private channels, but it's just something to be aware of. That you might think that you're managing all those messages, but there's this other repository silo of information that isn't managed by those policies. Okay. Now, here's a little about those different ways of doing it. So we have the expiration policy applied to the group, and you can set that based on a time period. So we're going to delete it after delete the group after 6 years, 5 years, 2 years after it was created, or you can base it on last activity. So if nothing's happened in that team for 2 years, then we start the deletion process. And there is emails go out to the team owner saying, this team is going to expire, do you want to renew, and so on. So there's warnings on that. And it goes to the team owner. And so it is worth, as part of your governance process, having more than one team owner, just in case someone is away for an extended period of time, and we don't want that team being deleted and all the content going. Retention policies. So say we can apply those to messages. We can also apply them to the files within SharePoint. But it's quite a blunt tool. So it's set at the team or site level, something that's done by an administrator, and it's applied to all content. So you have you can only have one policy that's applied to that content within the team and within the SharePoint site alongside it. So it'd be retain everything for 5 years and then delete, or whatever it may be. But there's no finesse around it. Retention labels are go one step further. So there's lots you can do with the retention labels and the policies that apply them. And it does require high licensing, as of course Microsoft want to sell you licenses. But it does give you a lot more. You can target particular types of content, and this is where the information architecture comes back in again. So you might might have retention policies that apply to content types. And you might, for example, minutes or policies are kept for a certain period of time, irrespective of where they sit. It might be based on a piece of metadata. So a trigger of when metadata says that this project is closed, we can drive the retention from that. So you get a lot more functionality with labels, and it allows you to do a lot more. And you can apply them at the document level. So you can have lots of labels applied to information within the site. Now it only can apply to the files stored in SharePoint. So you can't use labels for messages within Teams. So you might end up having a combination of retention policy and retention labels. Okay. Just something else to consider with this is the nature of precedence. So when we talk about retention deletion, there is a precedence, and basically it goes from retention labels, which are very specific, and especially if you've said something is to be retained, which prevents it being deleted. That takes precedence over a broad brush policy, and that retention policy takes precedence over expiration policy. So you might have the expiration policy, which gets rid of the team, but actually behind the scenes, the content is still preserved. It can still be, it's not visible, but it's still there, and eDiscovery can find it and so on. So in terms of your compliance, you're still keeping that information. That was a quick whiz through that sort of life cycle or the retention. Anyway, I mean, that's very, very high level. There's it's a whole nother several presentations, I think, on retention in Office 365. Just one more element around the lifecycle management is archiving. So what Microsoft calls archiving. So basically that can make a team read-only. So a team admin or the team owner can do this within the Teams interface, and basically hides the team and makes it read-only. So it hides it from your list of teams. You can still find it, and it's still, the content is still searchable, but it's just been locked down read-only. But note that if you're a team owner, you can still edit and delete documents. So it's not a true compliance option in that sense. It's still, the content is still, it's not immutable. So that's something to consider, but it can be helpful in just from a usability point of view, from not cluttering up people's views and so on, but just to say, actually, we don't need to have sight this team, we want to keep it, but we're just going to archive it. And it's there and it can be restored at any time. Okay. That's a quick whiz through, I think, some of the main elements around sort of teams and governance and architecture. There are other things to consider as well. How you manage external access. It's a kind of on and off by default. So if you are going back to where we're starting in terms of team creation, if you are letting anyone create a team, there is nothing to stop them, once they've created that team, of giving external access to people from outside your organization. So it's just something to be aware of in terms of control and having visibility of that. So again, you might want to think about that as a possible disadvantage of self-creation. Also controlling third-party apps. So Teams is, one of its features is it allows you to bolt on third-party apps, which may be beneficial, but you might want to think, well, actually, we need to control that because you don't know what's being added or for what purpose. So people might be adding other information repositories. They might be adding in Dropbox to there, and so you starting to lose control of it. So try and have some oversight of those third-party apps. Importantly, how does it fit with your existing architecture? So if you're already using SharePoint for document management, document storage, how does Teams impact that? Suddenly we're getting this, people saying, oh great, Teams, we can collaborate, we can chat, and we're using it lots of video conferencing. Oh, I can store files in Teams as well. So I don't, so I'm thinking, well, I can store my files in here. I'm not going to store them in that SharePoint site that someone created for us 2 years ago and where we were storing. So you could start getting this, there's a danger you start getting this information fragmentation with people storing things in Teams, and also they've got a SharePoint site over here. So you need to think about, if you're rolling out Teams, what exists already and what are you going to do with the SharePoint sites that you already have. Now there is something, a horrible word, you can teamify your sites. So you might have an existing SharePoint site. So rather than creating a team from scratch, you can actually teamify that site, which will give you a team, and we'll use that repository. So you kind of join the two up. So that's something to think about. And just in terms of findability, just think about search, just things to be aware of really, and where people might search from. So if people are searching within Teams, they can search across the files that's stored in Teams, they can search across the chat and so on. But you've also got search within SharePoint. So people searching in SharePoint search across existing SharePoint sites, but also the Teams SharePoint sites. So they'll be able to find files that way, but they're not finding the messages in chat within Teams. So it's slightly disjointed. And I know Microsoft are sort of looking at that, and as with all things Microsoft, it's evergreen. So the more things are coming online in terms of improvements and so on to search and other functionality. Okay, kind of reached the end now of that whistle-stop tour through Teams and governance and information architecture. So yeah, Teams, I mean, it's great. I mean, we, as an organization, we've kind of moved, use Teams all the time. It's our sort of de facto place to work now, and to store files. So we've been migrating stuff across from old SharePoint site into Teams. That's where we work now, and it's kind of is the future direction of travel for Microsoft. So it does have I think, a Teams first focus, and people do get value from it. You will get value from it, but if you don't think about governance, if you don't think about the architecture, then you are starting to get mess, and you're going to create problems for yourselves. I think people are already starting to see that, after they've sort of gone full tilt at Teams over the last year, 18 months or so. It's been great, and people have been able to work remotely, and it's been a great boon, but they're starting to see these problems emerge. So I think, bottom line, as many things, is consider what you're going to be doing, plan what you want to do, and proceed with caution, I think, and really think about that governance and having a provisioning process I think is the number one thing to take away. And I think that is it. So I think it's going over across to a bit of a Q&A session now. So if I stop sharing, perhaps. Nikki, were you going to take that?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions so far. First one is from Helen. She says, would you recommend connecting your team site document library to your team?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So so with, as I said, with Teams, you get your channels, and that gives you folders within a document library within SharePoint. You can also add in a document library from another SharePoint site as a tab, so it enables you to do that. So that way you have your existing SharePoint libraries and you're exposing them through a team. Where that can give you problems is that you can't turn off files within Teams, so the file tab. So that exists. So I think there is the danger of having information fragmentation again, of having two repositories. It's something that looked at and have done in places, and I think it's an option where you're not going Teams first, so where you have quite an existing structure that doesn't correspond directly to how people might be creating teams. I think it can be done. In a perfect world, it probably wouldn't be, but we don't live in a perfect world. So I think, again, it's sort of proceed with caution, and also with lots of communication and training for people just to explain where they should be storing information. Does that help?
Yeah, I think that was very informative. Helen would have to say if she thought it was useful. But yeah, I mean, I can see that if you've already got a document library set up, and you haven't done it thinking of with Teams in mind, then yeah, it can cause a bit of issues. David has asked a question: is there a best practice for using suffixes or prefixes in naming teams, or maybe the Microsoft 365's groups in general, as they are created in multiple places?
Yeah, so I think that it does. If you're using the group naming policy, it's sort of it can impose a sort of structure on it, but I think it's if you're just doing it as a convention rather than using an enforcement, if you like, and then I think it's up to your organization. It depends on how your organization is structured and what is important to you, I think. So if it's a prefix of something that represents the department or represents the project, and having that in there. There is, I suppose, one thing to be aware of is that within Teams, the left-hand navigation column is fixed width. So if you start having very, very long team names and start doing that, the end is going to disappear. So probably keep it short and snappy. I think it's whatever works best for your organisation.
Again, it does come back to this whole thing about looking at it and planning it first before jumping in, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Simon would like to know, what do you recommend for somebody wanting to get their hands dirty with metadata and policies in Teams?
So you can repeat that again?
What do you recommend for somebody wanting to get their hands dirty with metadata and policies in Teams?
I think just I think giving it a go within, because you are, I mean, if you can create a team and that has a SharePoint site behind it. I mean, depends on how your SharePoint is set up and so on, but you can start experimenting within that. I mean, with IT, it depends on level permissions and so on and who's controlling that, but there's lots of options around metadata within SharePoint, because that's essentially what we're talking about. With content types and with custom columns and with term sets or with and managed metadata. So I think it's probably trying that, work with your IT department and talk to them and see how they can help you, and because it might be, as I said, it might be about permissions, and it all depends on your environment. How that's set up. Do you have do you have test areas that you can, and sandbox areas where you can have free reign and go off and try stuff? I think it's just start doing it, and there's lots to read out there about how SharePoint uses metadata and what you can do with it. So I think it's just try it out.
I think is it LinkedIn training, or does actually they've got some SharePoint and Teams courses on that as well. That
there's lots of information.
Yeah.
There's lots of information out there.
So we don't have any more questions in the chat. I think you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question.
Can I ask a question, please?
Please go ahead.
Thanks, Alexander. That was very interesting. A very good overview. I just wondered, kind of a structural question, given that the world has been going towards metadata for so long, what do you think was in Microsoft's mind to have this, to make folders such a key plank of all this?
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose they because SharePoint sat behind it and they had this concept of channels, they wanted to have this concept of channels within Teams to allow you to have themes or topics within that, which makes perfect sense. But then they sort of thought, well, we've got SharePoint sitting behind it as the content layer. How do we translate that channel into something within SharePoint? And the simple way of doing that is, well, actually, we'll just have it as a have it as a folder. I mean, I've been never of the 100% opinion that folders are a bad thing. I think they have their uses. I think it's a combination of folders are one tool in your armory when you're thinking about architecture within SharePoint. But although they've started exposing folders, I suppose, now with channels, they're not it's not that they're giving up with metadata. I think it's still important, and although there has been talk about the SharePoint search is much improved now, and the way they're going, they won't need metadata. But you look at some of the stuff that Microsoft are doing now with their new artificial intelligence, Cortex and Syntax and things like that. that does have metadata sitting behind, and taxonomies sitting behind it to enable auto classification of documents. So I think metadata and taxonomy is still here to stay with Microsoft.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from anybody else? Please either just put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself. No? Okay. Well, I want to say thank you very much, Alex. That was really, I mean, I've been using Teams for a while now, and that's actually enlightened me on a few things myself, as well as exposed where the frustrations come from too. I think definitely proceed with caution and plan ahead is key to getting the most out of Teams. Oh, we do have another question. Bertha would like to know, do you think Teams can replace intranets?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Yeah, it's something I've kind of has crossed my mind. So yeah, because you can have an organization-wide team as well. So so if you want to have have it geared to the whole organization, I don't think it is, because an intranet is kind of a communications tool as well. It's a bit of a shop front within the organization. Teams doesn't quite have that visual ability to engage in that way, to have news stories perhaps which have images associated with them. So I think intranets, although to a certain extent some of the communication can be moved across and dissemination of information, I don't think it will be done in the same way. So I think there's still a role for the intranet, and an intranet as a portal and having links through to other systems and so on. I think the intranets, I don't think they replace intranets.
Okay. Another one from Helen. My memory is that there used to be a limit to the number of people who could belong to a team. Is there still a limit? Was there?
So if you have a team as an organization team, there I don't think there is. I'd have to check on that one. If it is, it's pretty large. Yeah, because there is this concept that is, you can have an organization-wide team. I'd have to check on that.
Thanks. And there's lots of thank yous coming up on chat as well.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Metataxis, for an excellent, as Adrian put it, an overview to Microsoft Teams. I just got a little announcement for our next meetup, which is on June the 15th at the same time. Chris Newell, lead research and development technologist from BBC, will be presenting to us semantic tagging and text classification for archives and content production systems. Thanks again, and thank you everybody joining us tonight, and have a lovely evening. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Alex.
Cheers. Bye. Bye, James.
Bye.
Bye.